right, up next is a woman, American woman, by the name of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She lives 1860 to 1935. She has a really fascinating life, in my opinion, and I love just thinking about the way that she was brought up and how her sort of living her life led to thinking the way that she did. Her father abandoned her and her family when she was pretty young, so they were often living with various relatives throughout the country. But she had a lot of pretty famous relatives that I think contributed to her way of thinking and the woman that she became. One of which was her aunt that she lived with frequently. Her aunt was Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. If you've never heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was the best-selling novel of the 19th century and the second best-selling book, second to the Bible. It's basically a story novel taking place in the slave South. It's actually credited with helping fuel the abolitionist cause in the 1850s because it was such a dramatic insight into what life was like in the South at the time. And Harriet Beecher Stowe is incredibly famous. If you take any literature class, American literature, I'm sure you'll hear her name. So Harriet Beecher Stowe was Gilman's aunt, and she lived with her frequently. Just an example of some of her relatives that she was influenced by. As a child, she lived a poor and lonely life. Her mother was pretty absent and kind of unaffectionate, and Gilman was kind of like a loner. She basically was completely self-taught. She taught herself to read at the age of 5, spent time learning on her own at the public library. She spent most of her time at the library when she was growing up, attended a few different public schools, but frustrated her teachers with her poor performances. Despite being incredibly academically gifted, she was incredibly intelligent, taught herself incredibly complex theories and concepts, but never could really perform well within the standard public schooling system, testing and like those kinds of things. She stopped attending school at the age of 15 and enrolled in the Rhode Island School of Design at the age of 18 with financial support from her father. It's important to note that her father kind of becomes more involved in her life, really just remotely. He never spends time with her, but they have kind of letter correspondence back and forth, and he's really into art and literature, and he sort of guides her through some of her education, kind of self-taught, gives her lists of books to read and things like that. And he really enables her to get into the Rhode Island School of Design. He pays for her to attend college. If you've never heard of the Rhode Island School of Design, it's still to this day one of the most prominent art institutions, art schools in the country. Maybe NYU is slightly better, but those two schools really are in the same conversation of being the most prominent and most selective and most famous art schools in the country. Gilman attends that at the age of 18. After graduating, she supports herself as an artist and as a writer, and she kind of dedicates herself to helping other artists kind of find their creative sort of energy and their creative inspiration and really hone their craft of painting or poetry or whatever it might be. She marries a doctor at the age of 24. This man had courted her in the past, and she had kind of sort of brushed him off. And then she becomes 24 years old, and he sort of re-enters the picture. And in my opinion, I think she kind of was like, wow, I'm 24 years old, which is really old in this time to not be married, and kind of settles with this man. She gets separated from him 4 years later, which is kind of interesting because that was an incredibly rare occurrence at the time. So they get divorced. They had one child together, a daughter. Just to kind of get an idea of how progressive Gilman was at the time, she actually sends her daughter to go live with the child's father, her ex-husband, and she writes a letter stating that she realizes that her ex is actually an incredibly good father, and she fully understands what it was like to grow up without a father in her life, and she doesn't want that for her daughter, and she fully respects her ex's now new wife, which is her daughter's stepmother, and respects her as a woman and a mother, and admits that her daughter will have a better life living with two parents. So sends her daughter off to live with her father, which is kind of interesting. She remarried in 1900. One of her first cousins, he was a Wall Street attorney, which we think now is really, really weird, but at the time it was really common for people to be in relationships with their cousins. So they get married, and they're married happily until the end of their lives, really his life. He dies unexpectedly of a brain aneurysm, and then that impacts Gilman a lot. We'll talk about that in a second. She first becomes famous for publishing a book called The Yellow Wallpaper, which you should have read. She publishes this in 1892. It's a short story. It's a work of fiction. This instantly becomes a bestseller and makes Gilman incredibly famous. She gets really, really well known in famous intellectual circles. She's invited to lecture and speak around the world as a result of this short story. So let's talk about really what this is for a second, so you can kind of figure out how impactful it was and why. So you read it and you should know this, but let's just dive into it a little bit and get some explanation. The story is the story of a woman who basically suffers from depression, and her physician prescribes her rest. Basically says, rest your feeble womanly mind. You just need to rest, and everything will be better. And so this woman's husband in the story is a doctor. He rents a cottage out in the country, in a summer house, and they go and live there for the summer. She lives in the attic of this large house, and in the attic is this atrocious, at least in her opinion, yellow wallpaper. And so she really never leaves the attic. For the most part, she has her meals there, and she, throughout the summer, the story is really a story of her slipping ever slowly into full-blown insanity, and really sort of having this battle with this wallpaper in this room. At one point, she asks her husband if she can repaint the room and take the wallpaper down, and he tells her no. It's just we're only going to be here for the summer. We're not going to waste our time doing that. So just deal with it, basically. The book basically ends with her. She's completely lost her mind at this point. She's having hallucinations of a woman in the wallpaper, and basically she's come to a point where she's not sure if she is the real woman or if she is the hallucination, and the woman on the other side of the wallpaper is the real woman. And she's frantically, chaotically running around the room, stripping the wallpaper off of the wall. Her husband comes, and he can't get in the room because she's thrown the key. And so he ends up breaking the door down and bursting into the room, and she's just running in circles, tearing down this wallpaper. And he faints out of shock of this scene of his wife doing this. And she just continues running in circles, jumping over his body, tearing down the wallpaper, and the book ends. So I hope that the feminist undertones really are easy to read if you sort of read between the lines. And this book is actually based on Gilman's life. She, after their daughter, suffered extreme postpartum depression. She went to her physician, and he prescribed exactly what the woman in the story gets prescribed. He says, you just need to go rest. Don't do any art. Don't write. Don't do any of those things. You just need to rest, and don't do the housework. You have a feeble, womanly mind. Just rest, and everything will be fine. And she, of course, is outraged by this. She's a writer. She's an artist. This is her outlet. She's incredibly intelligent. And so she sort of, in real life, goes back and forth with her husband, who was a father, and she sort of has to hide her writing from him whenever he comes around, and all of these interesting things. So she writes the story, and the story is really a story of how poorly women were treated in the medical industry at the time, especially when it came to mental illness, and how quickly doctors were to sort of discount their illnesses as purely a result of them being a woman. So she writes this, and it becomes incredibly famous. At one point, the story goes, she presented this to her physician, and he sort of blew it off and said, "You don't know what you're talking about." But then in reality, he actually changed his practices as a result of this story and how famous it became. Interestingly, the doctor in the story is loosely based on her husband, so you can see that he was kind of a dick in real life, and there's probably no mystery on why they got divorced. I'm sure he was not fit to deal with a woman of Gilman's stature and intelligence whatsoever. I'm assuming he was probably marrying a standard kind of Victorian era woman, of which Gilman was not. So by far her most famous book is The Yellow Wallpaper. In fact, some of you might have read this in high school or in a literature class at some point. Her next most important book is Women in Economics. She publishes this in 1898. It was by far the most important contribution to the science of economics by a woman at that time, and it was really one of the first sort of large, really productive economic works written by a woman. And the theme of this book is basically how women are treated unfairly in the modern American economy. It actually has a lot of the same themes as The Yellow Wallpaper, but where she sort of hides them between the lines in this work of fiction, The Yellow Wallpaper, she doesn't hide anything, and the gloves are sort of off in Women in Economics. I'm going to read a quote from her, and this is a pretty famous quote that she's sort of well known for, and you'll see how it's intentionally controversial to draw attention to the work. Quote, "The horse, in his free natural condition, is economically independent. He gets his living by his own exertions, irrespective of any other creature. The horse in his present conditions of slavery is economically dependent. He gets his living at the hands of his master, and his exertions, though strenuous, bear no direct relation to his living. In fact, the horses who are the best fed and cared for, and the horses who are the hardest worked are quite different animals. The horse works, it is true, but what he gets to eat depends on the power and will of his master. His living comes through another. He is economically dependent. So with the hard-worked savage or peasant woman, their labor is the property of another. They work under another will, and what they receive depends not on their labor, but on the power and will of another. They are economically dependent. This is true of the human female, both individually and collectively. The labor of horses enables men to produce more wealth than they otherwise could. The horse is an economic factor in society, but the horse is not economically independent, nor is the woman." So she sort of goes through here and intentionally says, women in our current economy are exactly like horses. They work, yes, that is true, but they fully depend on a man, in this case, for their survival, for their food, for their water, for instruction, that a horse and a woman are no different in our society. You can imagine how controversial this was, intentionally so. She also says things that are incredibly controversial for the time, things like women should be recognized in society. They are valuable in society, in the economy. Their work has economic value. Even if they are staying home and taking care of the kids and taking care of the house, that has economic value, and that should be recognized in society. She wasn't even advocated for women really to get paid for their work. She just wanted recognition for the female sex for the work that they were contributing to society. You can imagine how controversial that was, especially among the elite in society, because essentially society was structured where they got free child care for all of their workers. As long as the females in society were willing to adopt the standard traditional role of a woman in society, they were getting free child care. If they ever had to recognize that value or pay for that value, then their profits would have been impacted. This makes Gilman even more famous, Women in Economics, and she gets invited across the globe to speak about her feminist ideals. I don't know if Gilman planned it, but I like to think of it as she sort of rises to fame with this between-the-lines sort of feminist work of fiction in The Yellow Wallpaper, and she kind of tricks all of the male academics to, sort of recognizing her and saying, wow, this woman's incredible, this work of fiction is incredible, she's famous, you should invite her to speak and to lecture, and on and on and on. Then she sort of comes at them hard with Women in Economics and sort of takes off any veil of fiction And I like to think that they were sort of all forced to recognize this as productive work, because they had just said, this woman's incredible, this woman's famous, everything she writes is amazing, and then she writes Women in Economics, and they're forced to sort of be like, well, okay, damn it, I guess we can't go back on what we said before, so this is a good work of nonfiction that contributes to the field of economics. I think that if any other woman had written Women in Economics, it probably would have been discounted largely by academia, as many of the works that were being done by women were at the time. But because she sort of proved herself with with the Yellow Wallpaper first, I think they sort of were forced to recognize her value. She's definitely one of the first sort of women that was involved in this wave of the feminist movement that happened at this time. She was the first that was really outspoken and not quieted by male academics, largely because she had proved herself in literature with the Yellow Wallpaper. Interesting tidbit about Gilman: she was a huge proponent of euthanasia. She thought that people had the right to determine when they died, and shortly after her late husband dies of a brain aneurysm, she gets diagnosed with breast cancer. This is 1932. She's 72 years old. At the time, breast cancer was basically a death sentence. There was nothing they could really do for it, not even like they can today. So, being an advocate of euthanasia, she realizes that she doesn't want to go through this sort of slow, painful death caused by cancer, and she commits suicide 3 years after her diagnosis at the age of 75 in 1935. And she leaves this suicide note, and she says, "I chose chloroform over cancer." Sort of goes out still fighting for this belief in euthanasia that she had. So kind of interesting. Really the first woman that made huge contributions to the field of economics. The Yellow Wallpaper, incredibly famous. The first American woman to really contribute to social science.